Okay, good evening, folks. I think we're live. They're giving me counts and down, and not as much fun as it is on Sunday morning where you just go. But anyway, good evening. It's one thing. It's good to be back on Wednesdays after about a hiatus of about 3 months, I guess, or almost 3 months now. So good to see you tonight on that. Good to have you, and good to have those watching by way of live streaming. I know we have folks live streaming that part of Grace Church, and those that, friends of mine I know that are watching, that are not part of the church but watching because of the subject matter tonight. So I'm glad you're here. I'm excited about tonight and what these weeks are going to be. I think anybody that knows me, or at least knows me very, very well, knows that I am a huge proponent of why. Before we get to what and the where and the when, is the why. Even if, and some of you, I'm sure, in the room tonight, and those maybe watching by way of live streaming, you've gone over the good evening. It's Constitution and the Bill of Rights, good to be and back on Wednesdays. The other two primary documents of the founding fathers. A hiatus of about 3 months, I guess. Maybe have a pretty good handle on those in terms of what they are and what they say. Maybe for others, it's you kind of vaguely remember your civics class and what they may have said, and maybe much of that is gone. And maybe for others, it is just you don't have really any idea. You know that it is important. I'm glad you're here. I'm excited about tonight, but you don't know why these weeks are going to be necessarily. It's important. I think anybody that knows me good enough just simply to say, well, it is because it is. Knows that I am. Those don't garner any kind of why. I hate to say victories in terms of arguments. We're not trying to have victories. We're trying to get a message across. So with that said, we're going to spend the first couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, in dealing with the why. Even if why did these men do what they did tonight, and those maybe why did they do it? You have how they did it. You've gone how did they come up with that? Good evening. It's as I said, for those of you who may have seen the other Facebook Live we did yesterday down at the courthouse to talk about 3 months. I guess we've had those in terms of what they probably 70 years, at least maybe 60, from the 60s, in which there has been a massive turn in how this was communicated. The civics class, if you're my age, which a few of you in here tonight are at or around that, but I thought today there's a eerie similarity. You know, I was in high school and college in the 60s, and I saw a lot of the same kind of things we're seeing right now in that season, especially in the time we got to the late 60s, and I was a sophomore in college when they shot the kids at Kent State. That's been 50 years. That was just the live. They're giving me court anniversary of that a few weeks ago. But anyway, so I'm seeing some eerily similar things. Now, of course, I was oblivious to all of it at that point in time. I had one focus, and that was a round ball of bat. But some things happened to us then, if you realize that. The country changed, and I think for the most part, not for the good. So if you just simply say, well, we weathered the Vietnam War, and we weathered all the protests, and we weathered this, but there are huge components that we didn't weather well. I think, as I said yesterday, we are at an historic hinge point as a country. And I don't say that lightly. I don't try to give it preacher hype. I think we are at a historic hinge point, and you don't have many of those in a lifetime. Maybe a handful in a very long lifetime do you have these historical hinge points. I'm not trying to, at all, again, to be hyperbola. We're at a point where this nation could change completely and be so for generations. Because if there's anything we ought to understand, you can't flip a switch on this and change it. You can't flip a switch and change it back if we lose this. As one writer said, if you lose this, the freedom and liberty bequeathed to us in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights as a nation, if we lose it, it's gone. It's not, you can't revive that with a different administration. Do you understand that? That's somewhat of a mistake we've made as a nation, and we sure the dickens have made it as Christians. We just got to get the right group in, right side, and we're going to be all right. Well, I hope we found out that's probably not true. Now, well, I won't go there. We're going to stay on the Constitution and Bill of Rights. But anyway, enough said on that. It really is important we understand the why, because if you don't capture the why and keep the why in front of you, knowing the what won't give you enough power. Won't give you enough power in your own life, and certainly won't give you enough power as a nation, and so on. So, with that said, let's start. What I'm calling tonight's the grand experiment. If you can keep it, I mentioned that, I think, in Sunday's message. That was a message that came from Benjamin Franklin. I've got the kind of the Reader's Digest of what happened there. James McHenry, who was one of the delegates to the convention, he happened to be a medical doctor. He was from Maryland. He was one of the youngest. He was 34. Understand that when they walk out of this building, the Continental Convention, that day, this is it. They're done, or they believe they're done. After, I think, 100 days of negotiation and writing and rewriting and debates on the floor, and I'm sure much of it heated, although we don't, we just know from some of the writings that, so they walk out. James, the only reason we would know this happened is because McHenry hears it. Thank God he did hear it. So they walk out. Remember, they're done. They have written the documents. They think as best they can write them, and they're done. And a woman named Mrs. Powell, who knew Benjamin Franklin, as most everybody in Philadelphia would have known Franklin. He is 81 years old at this point. He has lived in Philadelphia since he was 17. So for 64 years, he's lived in Philadelphia. They knew who the esteemed Ben Franklin was. He was called the Sage of the Constitution. So he walks out, and this Mrs. Powell, who seems to be apparent, knew Franklin, and seems to be apparent that Franklin knew her. She said to him on that last day of the assembly, well, doctor, what do we have? A republic or a monarchy? And he said this. He shot back. Franklin was a fairly witty guy and was known for that. He said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. Two words I want us to focus on there tonight. If. So I'm convinced that Franklin, and I'm sure the rest of the signers and the framers of the Declaration, and the other 55, felt the same way. That it was not just simply because they had put all this work in, all this now is black ink on white paper, and it's down, that somehow it will self-perpetuate itself. So I think they full well knew that this is an if. The second word is you. Notice he doesn't say if the government can keep it, if the bureaucrats can keep it, if laws can keep it, none of that. He said, madam, you're going to have to keep it, meaning the people. And again, if we don't understand that as responsible individual citizens, but certainly as the nation, we're going to lose it. Republic, I should have put the definition of republic in your notes. I'll do that maybe next week. I got these printed out and then thought, boy, I should have put that in there. How many of you maybe don't know what a republic, what the definition of republic is? How many of you know we're a republic? Not a trick question. We are. We say we're certain things that we're not necessarily. We've heard things and we've heard things and we've heard things. We are a democratic republic, a state in which a supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives, a group with a certain equality between the members. I'll give you some Latin, res publica, which means public affair. This is a public affair. What the founders had designed could not be kept by the government. It couldn't be kept by bureaucracy. It couldn't be kept by political systems or by structures. It could only be kept by the people. This was, I think in the aspect of maybe, again, giving those examples, we know we've read the Constitution, we've read the Bill of Rights, so we know what it says, maybe minimally, maybe not at all. What we may not know and probably don't know is there had never, ever been anything like this in the history of governments that these men did. Nothing. The closest thing would have been 20 centuries before that with the Greeks, and that kind of fell apart. Until you go back to the Old Testament and covenant. We'll talk about that in ensuing weeks about the keeping of liberty and freedom. I recommended a book to Sherry, I think over the weekend. I'll recommend to you. It's not an easy reading book. It's called The Last Call for Liberty by Os Guinness. You may hate me after you buy it, if you do buy it. Os Guinness has a doctor of philosophy from Oxford, so he's brilliant beyond measure, but he's a committed evangelical believer, and while I'm sure he wouldn't call himself this, I say he's a prophet. We have all kinds of, that's another issue, I won't get into that tonight with here in live streaming. We have some misunderstanding about that as well too, but anyway, it's called The Last Call for Freedom. He takes, and we'll use some of his material. I'm only about 80 pages through the book right now. It's not easy reading. You go about 2 or 3 pages, mark things, and then you have to set, what is he saying here? I know it's important. I've highlighted it. It's important. But what does it mean? It is a timely book, but one that will frighten you when you read it. That's why I say you may not like me too much if you. So do it at your own risk. Don't send me emails and cards and catch me on Sunday mornings and say, why did you make me read that? That's kind of like the book by John Bevere, you know. It's written by eternity. His point is, now he is British descent, so here's somebody looking from the outside, although he's been in the United States for a number of years. His basic stance is, we either got to change, or, as Franklin said, you won't keep it. Now, for some of us, our age group, maybe that's not that big a deal, but I think you ought to be thinking about that for your kids and your grandkids. What is going to be left to them? What the framers had constructed was a republic, and given this fact, only we the people had the power to keep it. It was the grandest of experiments. No nation or government had ever been forged like this one. As Franklin declared, the people to whom the republic had been entrusted would either break it or they would protect it, that is, keep it. Now, why did the framers, again back to the why question, why did the framers and the founders believe that this republic could be kept by the people themselves? See, that had never been, in terms of nations, historical nations, they'd been basically centered around 2 things. You were French, you were Japanese, you were German, and raised from that. Or you were under an empire. You could have had very diverse people in terms of culture and so on, but somebody comes in and conquers you, and then all the set aside of your difference of your different speech and different culture and different way of life all comes under the heading, or the not heading, or is kept by the ruler, whoever the ruler is. Let me give you one in our present tense time. It's now, of course, he's gone because he got killed, but Saddam Hussein. You had Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Kurds. Right? All Muslims. Now, we look and say, well, they're all Muslims who don't like one another, who detest one another, who would kill one another at a heartbeat. So while Saddam Hussein was an evil man, guess what he did? He kept them from killing one another by the iron hand of a monarch, monarch as he were. So you had those two. Either they raised up because of language, group, culture, or they were conquered. But that's the only way it ever happened. Again, until you go back to biblical times. Now, why did the framers, the 55, let me back up something I should have said probably at the beginning, especially with those maybe watching by way of live streaming. In that 60 or 70 year push that we've seen over these last 60 or 70 years, there has been this attempt to rewrite this, assuming that people are not going to take enough opportunity and time on their own to find out whether this is right or not. Now, the thousands of young people we see on the streets now, we can either be screaming at what they're doing or not doing. Much of it, I'm not talking about the riot part. I understand that's anarchy there. That's flat anarchy. But maybe if they just knew, if somebody told them the truth, even what we're talking about in terms of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, because they've heard for 60 years. It was written by irreligious men who had no concern for a particular religion. They had no concern for the Bible. They'll parade out 4 or 5 or 6. I think David, help me, the wall builders. David Barton, who might say, if you get any of David Barton's stuff, I just got his book on the original intent. I haven't opened it yet, but he's probably the best historian on the Constitution and the founding fathers as anybody in the United States. But Barton says, here's what they do. They take about 4 or 5 or 6 that they parade out and say, here they were. All will be, number one will be Jefferson. Mark that down. We're going to look at several of the men and their background, but they parade Jefferson out because Jefferson was a deist. Meaning, Jefferson believed that Christianity was the supreme religious way, but he did not believe Jesus Christ was the way. He just believed Jesus Christ was a great teacher. So he was a deist, but certainly not an Orthodox Christian. So they parade Jefferson out because they said, well, look at Jefferson. Jefferson was irreligious. He was a deist. They parade Franklin out, although we're going to look at some of Franklin's things that he wrote and find out Franklin looked to the Bible and the history just as the others did, or most of the others did. And they'll also parade out James Madison, because Madison at the end of his life recanted some things he had said. He said, I wish I hadn't put that strongly about faith and so on. So they do that. I say all that to say they do that and then say, there you go. These men were irreligious. They didn't care about religion. As a matter of fact, you all know, all you young people know, this is in the Constitution, the separation of church and state. Now, if you ask anybody, go take a poll. Ask them in the Kroger store, in the Walmart, whether they're 17, certainly if they're 17 years old, they're going to say yes, separation of church and state. But a whole lot of 70-year-olds will probably go, well, sure, that's in the Constitution, separation of church and state. Well, no, it's not. But we've been told that for so very, 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 very long. But you can't just say, well, it's not in there. That's like saying, you need to believe this because it's the Bible. Well, I don't believe the Bible. Right? So, we're going to look at that, though. Let's go to one. Pull out your Constitution. Let me just give you a tease. We'll come back to this. Go to the second page of the Constitution. So flip it over, go to the second page. Go down to Section 7. Section 7, point number 2. This the framers put in the Constitution regarding the passing of bills. So this again's rather, I hope you've gathered there's not going to be shouting, dancing, spinning, yahooing, amen on this series. But much of the church is spun and danced and twirled and fell. The problem is they never learned anything. That's a hobby horse of mine. Anyway, number 2, every bill which shall be passed House Representatives, and goes on, talks about that. Drop down to about the middle of it. If after such reconsideration, 2/3 of the House shall agree to pass the bill and send the objections, blah, blah, blah. But in all such cases, the votes of both houses shall be determined by yeas and nays, and the name of the persons voting for and against the bill shall be entered into the journal of each house respectively. If any bill shall not be returned to the president within 10 days, what's it say next? Sundays accepted. Hold it a second. Now, if the framers were irreligious, agnostic, deists, as much of the proponents would try to tell us, why is Sundays there? If they had been pro-Judaism, they would have put except Saturdays. If they had been pro-Islam, they would have said except Fridays. Say, well, that's all well and good. Well, if they were completely irreligious, had no passion toward Christianity or Islam or Judaism or anything else, why didn't they go except Tuesday or Thursday or Monday? Just a thought. You can think about that one. We'll come back to a whole lot of these over the course of these weeks. So why did they think? What was the reason that the framers, and there are 55 of them that signed the document, 52 of them were active members of their local church. At least a couple of them were hardcore theologians who were also members of the gathering, the convention itself. Another just a thought. Why did they think they could govern themselves? Remember, this is a republic. You govern yourself. You elect the representatives. If the representatives don't do what you're supposed to do, we should be screaming at them that you represent us. Not your deal. You represent us. Read that in the Constitution. Why would they think for a moment that this ragtag bunch, at this point in time, is about 2.5 million people, understand that are diverse, that goes all the way from Massachusetts to Virginia to Georgia? Why in the world would they think that group of people could govern themselves? Well, one writer says here's maybe three, at least a starting point. They were heirs of the tradition of British law. And British law was the heir of covenant law, Bible principles, going all the way back to the Magna Carta of 1215. Number two, they had a deep and sincere respect for differing religious beliefs. You'll find as we go through this, when it says what they try to depict as, again, separation of church and state, it's evident, again, we'll look at the evident that the framers didn't see a separation of church and state. What they did not want was a state church. They've been there, done that. So for them, it didn't make any difference whether you were a Baptist, whether you were a Congregationalist, or any of the other myriad of denominations that already existed in the United States by that point. Nobody took preeminence. So that's in back here, very back, Bill of Rights, Amendment 1. We're not going to establish any of them higher than any of the rest of them. So there was this acceptance of the varying beliefs, and finally, because of their general stance on righteousness, this resulted in them faithfully governing themselves. Let me say without question, these men understood this only works with a healthy, believing people. And for them, it was Christianity. We'll see that more and more as we unwrap this over the weeks coming. Here's the truth. What the Constitution outlined with black ink on white paper could do little in of itself. Only those who would call themselves Americans could ensure that this document could be valid and sustained itself. That becomes all our responsibility. And they understood that. I hope that if we get anything across in these weeks, to understand that that's not Indianapolis' responsibility. It's not Frankfurt's responsibility. It's not Columbus' responsibility. It's not Washington's responsibility. It's our responsibility, individually. This document, Constitution and the Bill of Rights, were both genius. They were genius. And these men, while certainly we're not about to put it on the level of the Bible. Nothing but the Bible holds that level. But for the majority of these men, they believed that they had received this divinely. They believed that what they came up with, I shouldn't say came up, that sounds too trivial. What the ultimate design was, the vast majority of them believed they had heard from heaven to do what they did. So the document and the accompanying Bill of Rights were both genius and they were completely fragile. Here's the danger. If the fire of these documents and this great, grand idea of a democratic republic goes out, it goes out forever. And they knew that. That's why Franklin would say, if you, Mrs. Powell, and everybody like you can keep it. So here's the noble idea. The experiment launched in 1776. We know that from our history. We had to fill that out on some multiple choice test. It had never been done before. This was the first time that a nation had been formed that was not an ethnically or tribally similar people. English, French, Russian, I mentioned that earlier, or ethnic makeup, language, and culture. It also was not a nation made up of diverse peoples that was simply held together by a strong leader. And we see all kinds of examples of that. I gave you the example of Saddam Hussein. While they were all, we think those are all unique, or all in terms of Muslim, they're all Muslim, but if you pay any kind of attention, they don't particularly like one another. So, and there are, again, scores of examples of empires over the course of history. Sometimes those empires tend to be fairly benevolent. So the people underneath them live a pretty good life because it's a fairly good king or monarch or ruler. And of course, many of them, that's not the case. Or they come in and parade and declare certain things until they are elected, and then things change. Let me give you an example. We'll come back again to this in probably a week or two, but when we have tried to export this, and many of the ideas, you understand the Constitution has changed much of the world. Many countries have seen what our framers did, have attempted to do similar, some measure in some cases with some degree of success. But when we tried at times to, I'm not saying the people were wrong, but with the neoconservatives like Bush and Cheney, and I'm sure, I want to believe their heart was right, but they thought they could go into Iraq and establish a republic democracy like the United States. Well, that hadn't worked out so well. And we'll talk about why that doesn't work, going back again to the fact that what the framers believed, that there had to be a solid, ongoing, underpinning, righteous belief that says, while we have rule and law that keep bad people from shooting you or me and other aspects of life, but the framers believed if a righteous people can govern themselves, that by and large, I'm not going to shoot you, you're not going to shoot me, I'm not going to steal from you, you're not going to steal from me. Listen, friends, that's why this thing was so fragile and remains fragile. They trusted that the people would govern themselves, self-government, part of liberty, and or another definition probably of liberty. So the nation would be formed, instead, the nation would be formed by an idea, grand experiment, by citizens who bought into the idea. The glue's called liberty. And this liberty might also be called self-government. And again, we're going to dive into that probably in a couple of sessions, a couple of weeks going into that. So the miracle of self-government, at the time of this, what I'm calling a grand experiment, the idea of self-governing was completely unheard of. It was so unbelievable to even some Americans that they rejected the notion and chose to join the British Crown as Tories. You remember that from your history. There were people that didn't line up with Franklin and Madison and Adams and John Jay. And before we kind of cast rocks at them, I think they looked at this grand idea coming from British heritage, only knowing a monarch, and I think and maybe we would, maybe some of us would have, and said, there is no way this is going to work. No way. There's no way this is going to work. So because there's no way this is going to work, we better stay on the side of the British. Now, before, yeah. Yeah. Well, a few did, and then we won't go into what the Tories and the loyalists. But I try to understand how they could have seen that. You know, this again, remember, this had never been done before. Never. This concept had never been done before. So they had no, again, other than you look back to covenantal basis, it had never been done by a nation. So they had no history. So, well, it worked here and it worked here and worked here. Maybe this will work here. There was no track record of that. So they're saying, listen, we're going to submit to this. If this doesn't work, as I think it was Franklin said, one of the framers, I think it was Franklin, that said, we either hang together in this, boys, or we're all going to hang separately. Meaning we'll hang at the end of a British noose. So I try to get, rather than to be critical if they were traitors or something, like I said, listen, we're not convinced this is going to work. We have no track record of working, so I think we'll stay on the side of as a British loyalist, and they were called Tories or loyalists, was used in the American Revolution for those who remained loyal to the British crown. The idea of throwing away a concept of a monarchy was so radical to almost be preposterous. That's how big a deal this was. This was not just, let's kind of take something that's happened before and we'll tweak it a little bit here and tweak it a little bit there and hope it works. None of that. None of this had been done before. I'm trying to understand the why. But the cry of the founders and the framers was, we will have no government but the people themselves. Now, how would the people govern? To see any people that ever really governed themselves successfully, as I mentioned, could go back to Greece, and that was 20 centuries before. And this would have been kind of similar. It certainly would not have been a republic like the framers designed, but it was similar. But it was different in a whole lot of crucial ways. I'm not going to get into that. But so in 1776, again, you have essentially 2.5 million people in a expanse geographically that stretched all the way from Maine to Georgia. Why in the world did the founders believe that this novel approach had any chance of really working? They believed it would work, but why and how did they think that it would work? How could you have freedom and have that freedom coexist with government? Now, again, or not now again, there is again, the press and push and communication from certain segments that say, and we're seeing it, of course, at the forefront now, we don't believe you people can govern in this kind of environment. You need massive more help. We've never had COVID-19 before, right? Never in our history have we had COVID-19. You can't handle this, do it well, completely. So the only way that it will get handled is if we, the government, step in and throw a great deal more help to you. I think you hopefully do understand, this functions the same way in government as it does with individuals. The propensity is that once a person gets power, they want more power. Well, certainly with the government, when you give them something more of power and control, as palatable as it may seem at the moment, that never comes back to you. Study that from history as well, too. It never comes back to you. And it always then is more. Do you know when the income tax went into play? There was no income tax until I think 1918. I could be wrong on that in terms of 1 or 2 or 3 years, but and then it was, I think, 1%. Be happy with that today, wouldn't you? 5%, 7%. Why is that? Well, it's very simple, because the government continues to tell us you can't function without more and more of our help. Now, the framers looked, though, and said, how will we do this? How can it work that you can have freedom, liberty, self-government of the people and still have some form of government? Founders understood that for people to successfully govern themselves, 2 things were going to have to be in place, and these never existed before. Again, as this document was, and the whole idea and grand scheme of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, etc., these 2 had never been in play before either, but they needed to come into being simultaneously. Number 1 was the structure of the government. The founders knew that they knew from the Bible, and we'll talk more about that, and history, that fallen man would always seek for power. That was no mystery to these framers. Fallen mankind is going to seek for power. And once he or she gets power, or they, in terms of the government, they're going to seek for more power. They would, by their very nature, seek for more of that. The founders determined that for the concept to work, there would have to be checks and balances. This thinking came in largely from a gentleman named John Locke and Montesquieu. Locke was a British philosopher. Here's what he deemed the 3 natural rights. Among these fundamental natural rights, Locke said, are life, liberty, and property. Does that not sound like something that is contained in ours? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke believed that the most basic human law of nature is the preservation of mankind. To serve that purpose, he reasoned individuals have both a right and a duty to preserve their own lives. So they did not draw this completely out of a vacuum, that being the framers. And Montesquieu called the idea of dividing government power, he was a French philosopher, called the idea of dividing government power into 3 branches, what he called the separation of powers. So, the guys in the room in Philadelphia just didn't pull this out of the air. He thought it most important to create separate branches of government with equal but different powers. That way the government would avoid placing too much power with one individual or group of individuals. Again, we look at that now and say, well, that's the way it is. Well, it wasn't the way it was then. That was, even though Montesquieu and John Locke had some of the framework and some of their thinking, it had never been put in place before until now and us. What are those 3 branches? Legislative, executive, judicial, right? Does the judicial write laws? They're not supposed to. Right? Shake your heads, correct. That is correct. Not a trick question. Come on, this is not Sunday morning with your pastor. They're not to write laws. Again, you've either been asleep at the switch somewhere that if you don't see some very aggressive, renegade jurists who are writing laws or attempting to do so. Framers never, ever, ever, ever put that into place. The judicial was to do what? Rule on that laws that had already been established. So again, the thinking was that you would not have too much power in any one individual or group. It was not going to be a monarchy. Let me say this as well too, because you'll hear this from those that try to say, well, there shouldn't be Christian values in it. There was not Christian values from a standpoint of the framers. All you folks are looking for a theocracy. A theocracy would be a completely God-ruled government, right? That was not what the framers were advocating. And may I say, it's not what we advocate. We talk about kingdom and pushing the kingdom forward, but it's not about a theocracy. If you want to see I understand there are theocracies in place. You want to see them? They exist today. Iran, Saudi Arabia. Really anything under Sharia law is a theocracy. So we're not going to talk about theocracy. The framers certainly held that there would be Christian beliefs that would hold this together, keep it together, but then you'd be free to believe what you wanted to believe in terms of your own personal positions. You wouldn't be commanded, you wouldn't be commanded to bow to the state church. Or any church for that matter, but you wouldn't be commanded to bow to the state church. Number two, the second component was really the secret ingredient to this whole thing. And that is because it could not be created by some kind of system of government. It was not something that a 1,000-word draft could make happen. It was the answer to this question: what would enable a group of people to be trusted to govern themselves and then actually carry that out? Now, I'm sure they thought about this. If you allow fallen mankind in their selfish pursuits to elect leaders, will they not simply vote for men and women who would favor them? Yes. Again, not a trick question. Yes. The old adage, of course, you got to be my age to remember the chicken in every oven for everybody that votes. But give them what they want or what they think they want. We have a lot of that today, where they're voting because they think that's what they want, or otherwise curry to them. So they understood full well the fallen nature of mankind. These men were not oblivious to that. So how's that going to work? At some juncture, you're going to have but I'm convinced that in what they attempted to establish in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, was the best they could to avoid that at some juncture, but and you read some of their writings, many of their writings for that matter, that they envisioned down the road that that's what would happen. There'd be enough money and influence to curry people's votes that would not be in the best interest of all the people. And again, what Guinness talks about in this book called The Last Call, Freedom, was that covenantal basis that said, we're all in this together. The good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly of it, but we're in this together. Certainly one thing that history tells us clearly is that humans are selfish and desire power, so how would the grand idea of the founders ever work given the nature of mankind? The principle is pretty simple. The answer rests in the second component, and that was religion. Regardless of what the gainsayers try to tell us, that they were irreligious, agnostic, deist, they didn't want separation of church and state. No, as we plow through many of the things that they wrote, you'll find that if I can use the title of David Barton's book, The Original Intent, what the advocates say that there's no religion here. These men weren't interested in any religion, separation of church and state. While the document itself doesn't say Baptist or Nazarene or Congregationalist, when you look through the principles, you find principles, biblical principles, not Islamic principles. You find some Judeo-Christian principles, but in terms of the original intent, if you're in a court case, you have the facts and so on and so forth, and you're going to, what was the intent? What was the thinking prior to the commission of this crime? When we look, and we're going to look at them, the writings, many of the writings of primarily the framers, the 55 who wrote this document, signed it, you're going to find all kinds of a myriad that the folks on that side will never tell you it exists. That to read them is to say, these guys had a pretty specific view of how this would work and the principles that would make it work. And for it to ultimately hold together right and well and be fair and judicious to everybody would be because men and women followed righteous principles. All right. 8:16. We'll quit tonight. Get back at it next week. And stay with me because we'll get into some of the, again, writings of the men who were founders and framers. And you're going to find you have a very, very rich history as believers, but you have a very rich history in terms of the following of the Constitution. This is the greatest document in terms of government ever in the history of mankind. As fragile as it is. As fragile as it is. All right, thanks, guys. It's a church service, even though we're on a Constitution. I suppose we ought to pray and make it official, right? Since we didn't read a scripture. Thank you, Lord, for these folks gathered who are hungry to be not constitutional scholars, but knowledgeable in what the very backbone and framework and underpinning and life of this country, our country, really is, and how it can be held together and what our responsibility is for that. And so we can further hold our own heads up proud, saying, thank you, Lord, that you guided, directed even men who were not even deeply religious possibly, but you guided them, directed them to develop what has been the greatest country ever in the history of mankind. I pray, Lord, that we can keep it that way for our kids and our grandkids and beyond, for generations and generations until the Lord Jesus Christ returns again himself. Use us this week, Father, the remaining part of this week, for kingdom purpose. Let us, in the midst of maybe some chaos that's happening around communities and areas, that will be the love of Jesus Christ in flesh to humanity that needs to see the love of God clothed in flesh and blood. Thank you for it, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, guys.